"Make me your wife, or I'll die," said the Apache woman. The cowboy paused, then pulled her inside. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The wind carried a dry, biting cold that rattled the boards of the small cabin on the ridge. Snow lay in patches against the brush, frozen hard from nights of winter storms. The cabin stood plain and weathered, built from rough pine, with a stovepipe that pushed out a thin column of smoke. Inside, the air smelled of wood ash, beans, and damp leather. Cole Merritt sat at the table, shoulders hunched, running a whetstone along the edge of his hunting knife. His left leg stretched stiffly under the table, the joint tight from an old bullet wound he'd carried since the war. At 33, Cole was a man who had learned to live quiet. He had been a scout once, then a cattle hand, but grief had driven him away from the noise of men. Years before, his wife had died, giving birth to a child that hadn't lived either. After that, he put distance between himself and the world, building a life on silence, discipline, and small routines. He cooked the same meals, beans, bacon when he had it, bread he baked from coarse flour. He mended gear, stacked wood, split rounds for the stove. He spoke little to anyone. The townsfolk who saw him at the general store called him the quiet one out by the ridge. He never argued with a name. That night, the silence was broken. The knock at the door was sharp, too light for a man, too urgent to be mistaken for the wind. Cole set the knife down slowly, listening for another sound. His chest tightened. A stranger after dark could mean trouble, and out here trouble was often the only thing that came uninvited. He rose, the limp making his steps heavy, and unlatched the door. The cold pushed inside first. Then came the sight of her. She stood barefoot in the snow, dress torn at the seams, dark hair tangled by wind. Her skin was raw from exposure, her lips split from cold, but her eyes, sharp, black, and unflinching, fixed on him. Her chest rose quick with shallow breaths, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "Make me your wife, or I'll die." Cole didn't move. His first thought was disbelief, then suspicion. Why his cabin? Who was she running from? If he let her in, would others come after? His jaw tightened. Every instinct told him to keep his distance. He had survived by keeping doors shut, by letting no one close enough to open old wounds. But she didn't beg. She didn't cry. She spoke like someone who had already measured the cost of pride against the weight of survival. He searched her face for a sign of trickery, but found only exhaustion. Her hands shook as she clutched the torn dress close to the chest. She was young, maybe 25, but her body bore the marks of hunger and miles walked on bare feet. She was Apache, something the townsfolk whispered about with fear and prejudice. If she had come to his door, she had done it knowing that the wrong man might have thrown her back to the cold. Cole felt the old war inside him. Fear of risk, habit of caution, but also something else he hated to name. Pity, and maybe recognition. She was another soul who had been driven out, cut loose, left to fight for air. He stepped back, pulled the door wider, and let her in. The cabin smelled stronger with the wind at their backs, shut out. He nodded toward the chair by the stove. She moved slowly, legs stiff from cold, and sat without asking permission twice. Cole fetched a blanket from the cot and draped it over her shoulders. Her hands clutched the wool quick and hard, as if afraid he might take it back. He set beans in the pan and cut bread. He slid a plate across the table. She ate in silence, her eyes lifting often to watch him. When she spoke again, it was quieter. "Ayoka," she said, giving her name. "Cole Merritt." He answered, his voice low and rough from disuse. The room fell quiet again. The only sound was the crack of wood shifting in the stove. Cole kept his hands busy mending a torn strap of leather, but his thoughts pressed hard. He didn't know if she would try to stay one night or longer. He didn't know what her presence would bring, but he knew he had made a choice. Ayoka lay on the cot under the blanket when the lamp went out. Cole checked the bolt on the door twice, set the rifle in its place by the wall, then lowered himself onto his own bed. He did not sleep quick. He listened, the way he had on cold marches years ago, waiting for an enemy's step. Except tonight, He listened for her breathing. It steadied in time, slow and even. That was enough. Cole stared into the dark, fighting against the weight of what he'd allowed inside his door. He told himself it was only survival, nothing more. But the truth pressed heavier. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel empty. Morning crept in through the gaps in the shutters, pale light striping the rough floorboards. The stove had burned low, leaving only faint coals. Cole Merritt was already on his feet, moving stiff from the cold. He fed kindling into the stove, coaxed a flame, and set water to boil. The room filled slowly with warmth and the smell of smoke. Behind him, the cot creaked. Ayoka stirred under the blanket, her breath catching when the movement woke pain in her stiff body. She opened her eyes, unsure for a moment if last night had been a trick of the mind. The blanket in her hands and the heat of the stove told her it wasn't. Cole turned briefly when he heard her shift. His face was hard with habit, but his eyes checked her in a way that was not unkind. He set a tin cup of hot water on the table and cracked 2 eggs into the pan. He had only 4 left. He decided not to mention it. She rose, bare feet finding the rough boards, and kept the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He noticed how thin she was, the angles of her frame sharper than they should be, and how she stood straight anyway. When he slid the plate across to her, she hesitated as though waiting for him to pull it back. When he didn't, she ate quick, almost too quick, then slowed when she caught his eyes on her. He said nothing. Instead, he broke his bread in half and pushed a piece toward her. She lowered her gaze, then nodded slightly and took it. For the first time, he asked her question. Where from? His voice was quiet, even. Ayoka swallowed and looked past him to the window. South, near the San Pedro. She didn't add more. Her family, her people, that much hung between them unsaid. Cole knew better than to push. He only gave a short nod, filing it away. The silence stretched, but it wasn't as sharp as the night before. She asked next, why here? Alone? Cole's hands paused on the strap of leather he was mending. He looked down at it for a moment, then answered in pieces. War. Wife died. Child too. This was far enough. His voice carried no edge, just the plain facts of it. Her eyes lingered on him longer this time, studying him not with suspicion, but with something closer to understanding. Later that morning, he showed her the barrel outside, where they kept water from freezing with a plank across the top. She dipped the bucket, her hands raw but steady. He explained how to pull the grate in the stove so it wouldn't catch. She listened closely, copying each step without asking twice. When she carried the bucket back in, he noticed her shoulders had strength even after the cold and hunger. By midday, she had taken the torn seams of her dress and begun stitching them with thread from his repair box. Her movements were slow but practiced, fingers sure. Cole worked at the table with a strip of leather, and now and then their hands brushed when reaching for tools. Each time, she looked at him directly, waiting for him to flinch away. He didn't. The day passed in rhythm, him hauling wood, her mending, both of them eating sparingly from what he cooked. When dusk came and the wind rose outside, Ayoka wrapped the blanket tight and sat closer to the stove. She studied the room, her eyes resting on the small frame set on the shelf, a pressed flower and a faded scrap of cloth. She didn't ask about it, not yet, but she saw the way his gaze shifted when he noticed her looking. When night fell, Cole pointed to the cot again, his own bed waiting on the other side. She lay down without a word, but this time her breathing eased sooner. Cole lay awake listening again, the old habit of vigilance heavy in his chest. But there was a difference now. The cabin didn't feel like a place for one man only. It held 2 lives, cautious but present. Listeners who had wondered why she came to his door instead of the town would see it in how she moved, with the eyes of someone who had been turned away too many times to risk another. Listeners who asked why Cole let her in would find the answer in his quiet. He knew what it meant to lose everything and face a night alone. Both of them, though they had said little, carried the same truth. Staying alive began here, under one roof, with no certainty except the choice not to drive the other out. The third morning came with frost clinging thick to the window glass, thin veins of white spreading across the panes. Cole Merritt was up before first light, as he always was, feeding the stove back to life and setting coffee grounds in the pot. His limp was sharper in the cold, his left leg dragging a little heavier as he moved across the room. He noticed Ayoko watching him from the cot, her dark eyes following every step. She pulled the blanket close, but didn't hide her curiosity. She had seen him favor that leg since the first night, but now she asked plainly, her voice even. "Old wound." Cole paused with his hand on the stove door, then gave a short nod. "Cavalry. Bullet never set right." He didn't explain further, but the answer filled a silence listeners would have wondered about. The limp wasn't new, and it wasn't something that would heal. He lived with it, the same way he lived with the rest of his scars. Breakfast was simple again: bread, beans, and coffee thin enough to show the bottom of the tin cup. When Ayoka reached for the bread, she broke it in two and pushed a piece back across the table toward him. The small gesture made Cole hesitate for the first time in a long while. He took it, meeting her eyes, and something passed between them that felt steadier than words. After they ate, he spoke more than usual. Supplies were low, flour almost gone, lamp oil thin, coffee nearly dust at the bottom of the sack. "We ride to town," he said, his tone practical. He studied her for a moment, measuring the risks. The listeners who wondered why he hadn't kept her hidden would find their answer here. He couldn't, not if they planned to survive the winter. Town meant eyes, and eyes meant judgment, but hunger left no choice. He pulled his old cavalry coat from the peg and gave it to her, along with a pair of boots worn thin at the heels. The coat hung loose on her frame, but it was warmer than her torn dress. She slipped the boots on without complaint, even though they were too big and rubbed at the back of her ankles. She stood straighter once she was dressed, ready to go without asking questions. Outside, the mule stamped in the cold, steam rising from its nostrils. Cole adjusted the saddle and loaded a small sack to barter with. Ayoka climbed up behind him, wrapping her arms lightly around his waist. The contact made him stiffen for a breath, then settle into the rhythm of the ride. The trail cut along the frozen creek bed, the sound of hooves muffled against hard ground. As they rode, Ayoka asked quietly, "What will they say?" Cole's eyes stayed on the horizon. Nothing worth listening to. He knew better. The town was small, and people spoke loud when they thought someone didn't belong. By the time they reached the store, smoke hung low over the cluster of buildings. The bell above the door rang when Cole pushed it open. The owner looked up from the counter, his eyes moving first to Cole, then slower to Ayoka, standing close behind him. He didn't greet them. Two men by the stove turned their heads and watched without hiding it. Cole walked to the counter and laid out his list with the same even tone he used for everything: flour, coffee, lamp oil, salt. His voice carried no hesitation. The owner filled the order, but his hands moved slower than they needed to, and his eyes kept sliding back to Ayoka. One of the men by the stove cleared his throat, like he was preparing a word meant to sting. Cole turned his head just enough to let him know it would go nowhere. The room stayed quiet. Ayoka stood still through it, her back straight, eyes fixed ahead. She didn't shrink from the stares. If listeners wondered why she hadn't gone to town on her own before, the truth was plain. Alone, she would have been thrown out or worse. With Cole beside her, men still stared, but none moved closer. When the order was filled, Cole set coins on the counter and gathered the supplies. No one stopped them as they left, though the silence stretched heavy behind them. On the trail home, the wind cut sharp, and Ayoka pressed closer against his back for warmth. Her cheek brushed the collar of his coat. He didn't move away. He kept his eyes on the ridgeline, counting the fence posts that marked the way, but inside he felt the weight of her trust. She had asked him what the town would say. He had given her the only answer he could. Nothing that mattered. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was slipping behind the hills, turning the scrubland to long shadows. Cole unloaded the supplies and stacked them neatly on the shelf. Ayoka set the flour and oil in their place, her movements quick, as if she wanted to prove she belonged. That night, when they sat to eat, the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but of two people who had faced the world together and come back under one roof. The next morning came sharp and clear, the kind of cold that stiffened a man's joints before he even stood from his chair. Cole Merritt pulled on his coat and stepped outside, the air biting at his face, smoke from the chimney curling against a pale sky. He moved through the yard with a limp that was heavier in the cold, feeding the mule, checking the fence line, splitting a few logs to keep the stove fed. Each motion was practiced, but it was also the routine of a man who needed order to keep the day from sliding into thoughts he'd rather not face. Inside the cabin, Ayoka was already moving about. She had woken earlier than usual, set water to boil, and laid bread on the table. It was the first time she had done so without waiting for him to begin. When Cole came back in, stamping the cold from his boots, she slid a tin cup of hot water toward him without a word. For a moment he stood there, coat still on, surprised. He had lived years where no one thought to make a place ready for him. They ate in silence, beans and bread, the stove snapping behind them. It wasn't an uneasy quiet anymore, but it was heavy with things unsaid. Ayoka's eyes drifted again toward the small wooden frame on the shelf, the pressed flowers, the cloth folded inside. She had noticed it before, but had never asked. Listeners would have been wondering by now, too, curious why Cole lived alone with nothing but that frame to mark his past. She asked carefully, her voice even. Who were they? Cole's hand stopped halfway to his cup. He sat still for a long breath, jaw working. Then he set the cup down and answered, his voice flat, steady. My wife. She died giving birth. The child didn't live. The words landed hard in the room. Ayoka didn't look away. She gave a short nod, as if acknowledging the truth without pity. Cole appreciated that. Pity was something he couldn't stomach. After the meal, they worked side by side. She mended shirts with patient hands, sewing patches from flour sacks. He planed a board smooth with his knife, making a brace for the window frame that had begun to sag. They didn't need many words. He showed her how to check the hinge of the stove with the poker. She asked about where he kept the spare nails. It was the rhythm of two people adjusting to each other's presence. That afternoon, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Snowflakes swirled against the glass, though the storm didn't settle. Cole pulled more wood inside, setting it by the stove. Ayoka moved beside him without being asked, carrying smaller logs in her arms, her breath visible in the chill. When she bent near the stove to stack them, her dress pulled at the seams she had stitched back together. Cole caught the line of her collarbone and the faint glimpse of skin through the mended cloth. He looked away quickly, his jaw tightening, but the sight stayed with him longer than he wanted. Later, when the stove glowed steady, Ayoka coughed into her hand. It was a dry sound, rough from the cold she had carried since arriving. She tried to make it quiet, but Cole heard it. He set a kettle on the stove and mixed hot water with honey from the small jar he kept for winter sickness. He handed it to her without comment, and she took it, fingers brushing his. Their eyes met briefly, and she held the cup with both hands, drinking slow. That night, when the lamp was turned down, she lay on the cot and pulled the blanket high. Cole sat longer at the table, staring at the knife he had sharpened the night before. His thoughts pressed against him. The risk of letting her stay, the weight of old loss, and the knowledge that the cabin no longer felt empty in the same way. He rubbed his stiff thigh, then glanced toward her. Her breathing had steadied already, soft and even. Listeners who had wondered whether she was only safe here for a night or two now had their answer taking shape. She was still here, still working, still breathing under his roof. Cole hadn't said it out loud, but his actions had. He was not sending her away. Not now. Maybe not ever. Snow fell heavy during the night, and by morning the yard was buried clean to the top of the fence rails. The cabin groaned under the weight, the roof lined thick with white. Cole pushed the door open with his shoulder, carrying an armful of wood back inside. His breath steamed in the air, his limp pronounced from the cold, but he said nothing of it. Ayoka watched him from the table, where she had been setting out bread and boiling water. She rose, took the wood from him, and stacked it by the stove before he could protest. It was a small act, but one that spoke louder than thanks. They ate in silence, beans warmed again, coffee thin but hot. Ayoka had grown stronger in the weeks since leaving the barn. Her cheeks held color now, her hands steady as she mended clothes or carried water. Yet doubt lingered in her chest. She still wondered if this place was temporary, if one day he would decide she had stayed long enough. Listeners, too, would have asked this question. Was she safe here for good, or only for a season? Cole seemed to sense it. After the meal, he fetched a wide board of cottonwood he had cut weeks earlier and set it across the table. He pulled out tools, knife, all in a small file. Ayoka tilted her head, curious. "What is it?" she asked. Cole didn't look up. "Shelf. For you. Space for sewing things." His voice was even, but the meaning carried weight. A shelf wasn't for a guest. It was for someone staying. She helped hold the board steady as he cut. When the knife slipped once, his hand brushed hers, callous skin against hers for the briefest moment. Neither pulled away quickly. She watched him work, his jaw set, his movements careful even when his hand trembled in the cold. For the first time, she realized how much pain he carried every day in silence. The limp, the scars, the stiffness, things he never spoke of but endured with quiet resolve. By afternoon, the storm eased, leaving the cabin in deep quiet. Together, they carried the shelf to the wall above the table. Cole hammered it into place, each strike of the nail sounding final. When it held firm, he stepped back, letting her look. She set her needle and thread there, then placed a folded scrap of cloth on the edge, as if to mark it. She turned to him, and though her words were few, her voice held steady. "Thank you." That night, as the fire burned low, Ayoka bent near the stove to stir the pot. The light caught her face, her dress pulled slightly at the seam she had repaired, and Cole's eyes lingered longer than before. He looked away quickly, ashamed of the pull he felt. But when she glanced back, she didn't scold him with her eyes. She only held his gaze for a breath before returning to her task. Listeners who might have wondered whether Cole ever allowed himself to want more than survival now had their first glimpse of the answer. He was still a man, still capable of looking, of feeling. And Ayoka, though scarred by hunger and hardship, was still a woman who noticed the way his eyes lingered. When the lamp was lowered, Cole checked the bolt on the door, then his rifle by the wall. Routine kept him steady. But when he lay down, his thoughts pressed against him harder than usual. She had her shelf now. She had worked in his space like it was hers. And for the first time in years, he wondered not if she would leave, but if he could ever imagine the cabin without her in it. The snow began to thaw in patches by the second week of March, leaving muddy ground where the sun reached longest. Supplies had run thin again, flour nearly gone, lamp oil burned down to its last inch in the glass. Cole Merritt knew there was no avoiding town. He told Ayoka plain at the table one morning, "We ride tomorrow. Need nails, flour, cartridges." His tone left no room for doubt, but his eyes rested on her for a moment longer than usual. He was thinking what listeners would also be wondering. Would she go with him openly after the stares they had faced last time? She answered by pulling on the cavalry coat he had given her weeks earlier and tightening the belt around her waist. "I will go," she said steady. The matter was settled. They left before midday. The mule stamped impatiently as Cole loaded the pack saddle, the sound of leather straps snapping into place, carrying across the yard. Ayoka climbed up behind him, her hands at his waist again. She no longer hesitated at the closeness, and he no longer stiffened when she leaned against his back. The trail was muddy at the edges, water glinting under weak sun. His limp was worse in the damp, but he kept the mule at a steady pace. When they reached town, the same bell rang above the store door. Inside, the air was warmer but thick with smoke from the stove. The owner looked up without greeting, then moved to fill the order. Two of the same men sat near the stove again, and this time one of them spoke. "Stray dogs aren't the only things folks should keep outside," he said, his tone deliberate. Cole set the flour sack on the counter harder than necessary, coins in his other hand. His voice stayed even. "I pay cash, I take my goods. Rest is nothing to me." He didn't raise his voice, but the weight in it was enough. The owner glanced between them, hesitated, then quietly measured out the coffee and lamp oil. The man by the stove muttered again, lower this time, but Cole turned his head just enough to let his eyes meet his. He didn't rest his hand on the revolver. He didn't need to. The man's words fell flat in the silence. Ayoka stood tall beside Cole, eyes steady on the counter. She did not flinch, though her hands tightened inside the sleeves of the coat. Listeners who might have wondered whether she feared the town's judgment could see it now. She carried herself straight, but the truth was there in the way her breath came quicker under the weight of those eyes. She had been cast out enough times to know danger when she felt it. On their way out, a deputy leaned against the post outside, chewing slow. Some folks don't like trouble, Merritt, he said. Best keep to yourself. Cole stopped, adjusted the load on the mule, and answered without looking at him. Always have. Then he walked on. The deputy didn't follow. The ride home was quieter. The sun dropped low, painting the ridges in orange. At one rough stretch of road, Ayoka steadied herself with her cheek against his shoulder. For the first time, she stayed there, not pulling back. Cole's chest tightened at the warmth of it. He kept his eyes on the trail, but when they stopped to water the mule, she met his gaze. Her eyes flicked to his mouth, then back to his eyes. He didn't speak. He leaned in slow, careful, and kissed her once, then again longer, his hand rising to her cheek. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers brushed the back of his neck, holding him there until the cold air forced them to move on. When they reached the cabin, the lamp oil burned steady again, flour filled the bin, and nails clinked in the tin. Nothing outside looked different, but everything between them had shifted. Listeners who had wondered whether Cole could allow himself to feel again now had their answer. He had kissed her, not from pity, not from obligation, but from want. And Ayoka had kissed him back, not as a plea for safety, but as a choice. The storm came down from the north 2 nights later, a hard wind that shook the shutters and filled every crack of the cabin with its whistle. Snow piled against the door until the latch groaned under its weight. Cole Merritt set extra wood by the stove, his limp more pronounced from the cold, his breath short as he moved. Ayoka worked at his side without needing to be told, carrying smaller logs, filling the kettle, and checking that the blankets were ready. The room grew warmer, but the wind outside made the cabin feel small, fragile against the night. They ate beans and bread again, sitting close to the stove. The silence between them had changed since the kiss on the trail. They didn't speak of it, but every glance carried its memory. Ayoka's eyes lingered longer on him, her voice softer when she asked, "Your leg, does it hurt worse when storms come?" Cole gave a short nod. He had never explained before, but the question pulled it from him. A bullet. Cavalry days. Weather brings it back. She didn't offer pity, only shifted closer to hand him the cup. That quiet respect was something he had not felt in years. As night deepened, the wind rose until it drowned out every other sound. Ayoka lay on the cot at first, blanket tight around her shoulders. Cole settled into his bed across the room, the firelight throwing faint orange across the beams. The cabin creaked, snow pressing harder against the walls. After a time, Ayoka rose. Her bare feet touched the cold floor, her blanket still wrapped around her. She crossed the small space and stood beside his bed. He looked up at her, steady, saying nothing. She pulled the blanket back and slipped beneath his, moving close without hesitation. Her body was cold against him at first, her breath visible in the chill air. Cole hesitated, every muscle tense, the old habit of keeping distance pressing against the moment. But then he turned his arm under her shoulders and drew her nearer. She rested her head against his chest, her hand settling over the scarred place on his ribs. His heart beat hard enough that she must have felt it. He didn't speak. He only held her, the heat of her body slowly warming against his. Listeners who might have wondered whether their bond would remain only in silence now had their answer. This was no accident of cold. Ayoka could have stayed wrapped in her cot, but she chose his bed. And Cole, who had kept everyone at arm's length for years, chose not to send her back. The storm rattled until near dawn, but inside the cabin, their breathing fell into rhythm. Now and then she shifted, her leg draped across his, her fingers brushing his jaw. Once, he kissed her in the dark, slow and careful, her lips soft against his. They stayed close through the night, neither rushing the moment, both knowing it marked a line crossed. When morning came, the wind had eased. Snow lay high against the windows, the door half buried. But the cabin held steady, and so did they. Cole rose to stoke the stove, Ayoka still wrapped in the blanket on his bed. She watched him move across the room, her eyes calm, no trace of the guarded suspicion she had carried the first night. For the first time in years, Cole looked at his home and didn't see only a shelter against the cold. He saw someone there with him, not out of chance but out of choice. By the time the snow began to soften and streams of water trickled under the crust of ice, Cole Merritt knew he could not put off the choice that had been growing inside him. They had weathered storms together, shared the same bed, worked the same ground, and the silence between them was no longer a wall but a language. Yet he also knew the town would not stay quiet forever. Listeners would have wondered when the two of them would face that test. What others would say, whether Cole would acknowledge Ayoka in front of men who measured worth with names and paper. One morning, he sat at the table while Ayoka cut strips of cloth for mending. His hand rested on the wood, tapping once before he spoke. If this is more than winter, it needs to be written down. In town, with a name. Both of us. His words were simple, but the weight of them filled the room. Ayoka set the scissors down and turned to him. Her eyes were steady, her voice firm. The night I came, I asked for wife because I had nothing left. No family, no place. I didn't want to beg for food or hide in barns. I wanted a name, a place, and a man who would not turn me out. She looked at him directly, the truth plain. You opened the door. You stayed. Cole nodded once. He understood better now what listeners might have asked from the start. Why those exact words at his door? It had not been desperation only, but a way of asking for permanence, a bond stronger than pity. They rode into town the next day under a sky pale with early spring. Mud pulled at the mule's hooves, water running in lines down the ruts of the road. Ayoka rode beside him this time, not behind. Her coat was belted tight, her hair braided against the wind. Cole's limp slowed the pace when he dismounted, but he held his head high as they walked into the small office where the justice of the peace kept his records. The justice was a narrow man with ink-stained fingers and a mouth set in a thin line. He looked from Cole to Ayoka, then back again. Is this by force? He asked flatly. No, Cole answered. No, Ayoka echoed, her voice steady. The justice studied them for a moment longer, then reached for the ledger. You'll need a witness. It was the store owner who stepped forward from the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. He had followed them from the counter when he saw where they were headed. He didn't smile, but he gave a short nod. I'll sign. The justice dipped his pen, wrote careful block letters. Cole Merritt. Then he looked at her. Your mark. Ayoka hesitated, the quill in her hand. Listeners might have wondered, could she write? The answer showed itself when she pressed the quill down and formed her name in careful strokes. Ayoka. Not perfect, but hers. The justice leaned back, eyebrows raised slightly. Then he wrote Merritt beside it. When they stepped outside, the deputy leaned against the post, tipping his hat. His words were few, but they carried meaning. Town watch. But law's law. Your man and wife now. Cole bought a plain band from a cigar box of trinkets on the store porch. It wasn't gold, only brass, but he slid on her finger where anyone could see. Ayoka looked at it, then pressed her forehead to his cheek, standing there for a long breath. They loaded flour and seed onto the mule and turned back toward the ridge. On the trail home, the air felt cleaner, the weight between them lighter. The choice was no longer only theirs inside the cabin walls. It had been spoken, written, witnessed. When they returned, Cole set the sack of seed on the table and said, We'll plant when ground softens. Ayoka touched the band on her hand, then looked at him with a calm that hadn't been there before. She had her place. He had given it, and claimed it too. Spring came slow to the ridge, but it came. The snow pulled back into the gullies, the ground softened, and the air carried the smell of wet earth. Cole Merritt worked the soil with a short-handled hoe, his limp slowing him but never stopping him. Beside him, Ayoka bent low, strong inner movements now, planting seeds into the dark rows. The cabin that once looked like it belonged to one man now showed the marks of two lives. New shelves built into the walls, fresh linens drying on a line, a second coat hung by the door, her basket of sewing supplies set neat on the shelf he had made for her. Listeners who had wondered if Ayoka would ever truly belong had their answer in every detail. She had not only stayed, she had made the place her own. And Cole, who once lived only by habit and silence, had allowed it, even welcomed it. At night, they shared the bed openly. There was no longer a cot by the wall. The stove burned steady, and the warmth between them was more than fire. Ayoka sometimes reached for his scarred leg, not with pity, but with understanding, and Cole no longer pulled away. The touch meant she saw the whole of him and stayed. One evening, as they sat on the stoop watching the sun dip low across the scrubland, Cole spoke. His voice was quiet, but there was no hesitation. I thought this house would always be empty, just a place to keep out weather. You changed that. Ayoka turned her hand, showing the brass band glinting faintly in the light. I thought I would always be a burden, moving from place to place. But now I have a name and a place. You gave me both. The mule brayed from the corral, and Cole rose stiffly, his limp visible but steady. Ayoka followed, and together they closed the gate and set hay in the trough. Simple work, done side by side, but it carried a weight no one else would see. Inside, Cole had built something more than shelves. Against the wall stood a crib rail he had cut from cottonwood. He hadn't said much while making it, but his hands worked with a focus she recognized. When it was finished, she stood behind him, her hands resting over his. They didn't speak because the meaning was already clear. The future would not be just the two of them. There would be room for more when the time came. On Sundays, they rode into town together. People stared at first, but no one spoke. The store owner nodded when they entered, and the deputy tipped his hat in quiet acknowledgement. The same men who had once muttered by the stove now looked down at their boots when Cole's eyes passed over them. Law and marriage had silenced their talk, and Cole's steady presence made it clear he would not bend. One afternoon, the store owner handed Ayoka a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a stronger needle and a spool of good thread. He said nothing, only turned back to the counter, but the gesture said enough. She had been seen as Cole's wife, not an outsider. By the end of that spring, the land was greening, beans were pushing up through the soil, and the cabin held the sound of two voices, two sets of footsteps, two lives joined. The man who had once believed silence was his only company now shared his days with someone who matched his strength with her own. The woman who had once stood barefoot in the snow, asking for a chance to live, now stood inside a home that was hers by name and by choice. For the listeners who might have doubted whether this story would end in permanence, the proof was plain. Cole and Ayoka were husband and wife, their names written side by side in the ledger of the town, their lives bound together in the daily rhythm of work, quiet, and trust. The cabin was no longer a lonely shelter. It was a home. As the sun dropped behind the ridge that night, Cole drew Ayoka close, kissed her slow, and for the first time in years allowed himself a small smile. She laughed quietly into his shoulder, the sound carrying into the fading light. No questions remained, no fears left unspoken. They had chosen each other, and they would keep choosing each other every day that followed. The story ended not in silence, but in the steady certainty of a life they would share.